Hey, Bulletin listeners, this is Mike Cosper letting you know that this episode, which talks about national security and the election, was recorded before the events of this weekend, which involved what the FBI has described as a attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. We'll be discussing those events on future episodes of the podcast. Meanwhile, this conversation about national security, great power conflict, and the perspective of Christians in the face of these challenges remains, we believe, quite relevant. So thanks for listening, and we will see you on Friday for a conversation about the events of this weekend and what we know by then.
So when you think of things that Americans care about, free speech, lack of censorship, not being manipulated, not having our information manipulated. I mean, all of those things are markers of the Chinese government. And so to the extent that China is able to gain leverage and power over the United States with its military and its economy, you're going to see shades of that in the United States and the rest of our ally countries.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper, and today I want to invite you into a little bit of a different conversation than usual. One about the threats that are facing our country in a complex, contested, and unstable world. My conversation partner is Rebeccah Heinrichs, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and the director of the Keystone Defense Initiative. Rebeccah Heinrichs is someone whose entire professional life has been dedicated to understanding great power conflicts, the clash between nations and empires, and how that history might shed light on our present moment. That's a conversation that's more relevant now than in a long, long time. The fact is that we live in a precarious moment. Land war is roaring in Europe for the first time in 80 years. Navies are clashing on a regular basis in the South Pacific. And another war rages in the Middle East, whose repercussions shape not only that region, Europe, and the international order, but the day-to-day stability of our colleges and universities. Rebeccah Heinrichs pulls no punches in this conversation. And regardless of whether you agree with her conclusions, her analysis is essential listening. She's someone who speaks from a deep love of her country, but also a deep conviction in the gospel and a profound commitment to the local church. So, I encourage you, skeptic, cynic, or true believer from the start, I think there's a lot to glean from my conversation with Rebeccah Heinrichs. Thanks for listening. Rebeccah Heinrichs, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and your research focus.
Sure. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and my main vocation is doing national security and defense. So I specifically focus on strategic deterrence, which is how to prevent major war. So right after 9/11, a lot of people focused on anti-terrorism, counterterrorism. That was not my focus. I kind of had this realization. I was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened, and that was when I decided I wanted to focus my work on defense and national security policy. But it occurred to me at the time, there are people out there who hate what the United States is. They're determined to harm us, but Islamic radicalism, militantism is not what could actually end this experiment in self-government. It's going to be major power. So then my focus was mainly Russia as the power that had the greatest capability to do the greatest harm against the United States. So that became my area of focus and study. And so I'm out here in Washington, D.C. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson Institute and focusing my work on strategic deterrence and then how to win if we do have a failure of deterrence. And so, of course, the two major powers that I'm focusing now are both China and Russia.
Why should we be concerned about great power conflict at this point?
I'm kind of the generation that was born at the time that Reagan ended the Cold War and really ushered in a time of peace and prosperity where the United States really sat atop all other state powers as the most powerful economically, militarily. And when that happened, then you had H.W. Bush was sort of the president who helped us navigate what to do next. I mean, he was the one who led the greatest effort to dismantle American nuclear weapons that, from his perspective, we no longer needed. We didn't have the Soviet Empire to deter. And then we went through this time period where, because of our relative strength, there really wasn't a power who was contesting the United States. But we as human beings did not evolve to the point at which warfare was beneath us, that the human instinct to subjugate wasn't gone. We were just at a time of really just relative peace. And so now here we are, 40 years later, where you have an axis developing among the Chinese, really at the top here, and then the Russians, the North Koreans, and the Iran regime. And China got very, very wealthy during this 40-year period after the Cold War, where both Republicans and Democrats held on to what I believe is this erroneous assumption that we had sort of evolved past major power competition, major power conflict. And so that if we could essentially replace the threat of hard power with trade, and that if we welcomed the Chinese into the global economy, that they would liberalize, that they wouldn't have an incentive to go to war, and they would essentially open up and become, if not true, Jeffersonian Democrats, just benign and more peaceful. But of course, they're still communists. They got very, very rich, and they used that wealth. They hid their hand. They said they were hiding and biding. They were waiting until they were powerful enough. But they took all this wealth. Now we've really seen this with Xi Jinping and his rise and consolidation of power. They put it into their military to contest the United States. And so now the Chinese have a very strong, formidable military. And they specifically invested it in weapon systems to contest the United States, to be able to push us out of the Pacific. And it's an authoritarian country. I tell people it's the world's most sophisticated techno-authoritarian country. And so now you see the Chinese are working with the Russians, who still viewed the United States as an adversary, even if the then candidate Obama didn't view them as an adversary, and he did not. And Obama's policy documents even said that they were no longer an adversary. But you have these adversaries that were never satisfied with the United States being the preeminent power. And so now they see this as an opportunity to collaborate, to contest the United States and contest our alliances. And so that, to me, I think we are in the next decade of extreme danger with this developing axis.
Yeah. Feels like we're living in this precarious moment as well. Hannah Arendt loved this phrase, that it's a curse to live in interesting times. And it certainly seems that that's the case right now. Walk us through what's happening on the world stage. What should we be concerned about? I mean, obviously there's a war in Ukraine. There's a war going on in Gaza. We've got a lot of American firepower in the Middle East right now. But what else is happening? What does it mean that China is trying to contest us?
What happens in the world is really shaped by the most powerful countries. And then you have the middle powers, and the smaller powers are making decisions based on the actions and the behaviors of the larger, more powerful countries. And so back to this axis, I mean, you mentioned it's Iranian proxies that are attacking Israel throughout the Middle East. So, I mean, yes, it's Gaza, but Hamas is only strong because it has weapons from Iran. The Houthis are trying to close down the Red Sea, but the Houthis are armed by the Iranians. And then there's all kinds of terrorist activity throughout Iraq and Syria, and again, funded by and helped by the IRGC, the terrorist militant wing of the Iran regime. But they're able to act that way because they do have a patron. Russia has been in favor of and has sided with what the Iranians are doing in the region. And Russia is being backed by the PRC in its war against Ukraine. And so these events they seem disconnected, but they're actually quite connected. And Russia now has this partnership with the North Koreans. It used to be American policymakers used to think that you could sort of shame Russia into not collaborating with North Korea. I mean, North Korea is just this very backwards, oppressive regime, no economy basically to speak of. Its population are essentially slaves to Kim family. But now you have the Russians, Vladimir Putin, going to North Korea, and then because they want the munitions that North Korea can produce. So that, to me, is the cooperation between these powers to undermine the United States. And so whenever I say, the U.S.-led order, again, I really mean, really, since the Cold War, the United States being the preeminent power, we have been the country that has valued human rights, dynamic self-government, the rule of law, the sovereignty of nations. Obviously not perfectly, but that has been how the system of global affairs has tilted. And then the global commons. We do not tolerate pirates in international waters, but even in outer space, we set the norms for responsible behavior in outer space. I mean, the planet is big, but it's not that big when you're talking about shared spaces with countries that have powerful weapons. The PRC has not viewed that as something that it wants to tolerate now that it has the ability to do that. It wants a world in which it is the dominant power, and that the characteristics that define the Chinese Communist Party are the characteristics that are favored. Not to say that it's not like the Soviet Union where it's, kind of running through the whole world and trying to make it China, but to tilt it to benefit the Chinese government at our detriment. So when you think of things that Americans care about, free speech, lack of censorship, not being manipulated, not having our information manipulated. I mean, all of those things are markers of the Chinese government. And so to the extent that China is able to gain leverage and power over the United States with its military and its economy, you're going to see shades of that in the United States and the rest of our ally countries and friends as well. And you can kind of let your imagination kind of look through, what kind of world will it be? You look inside China and how it's running its government. And then you're going to see a world, with flavors of that to benefit the Chinese government at our expense. And it can get worse from there. And China has been very clear, the Chinese Communist Party, that wants to subjugate Taiwan. It believes Taiwan, democratic free Taiwan, is part of China. But it's not just Taiwan. It's got other claims too.
Just this week, Chinese Coast Guard ships were ramming
Philippines
Coast Guard ships. And we're treaty bound to defend the Philippines, right? So what does escalation look like? If things start to get bad.
I do work with the U.S. Strategic Command, which is our command that has control over our nuclear weapons. And they're out in Omaha, Nebraska. And they're the ones I tell people, the United States of America is using nuclear weapons every day. We use our nuclear weapons to credibly convince our adversary that the United States has the ability and the will to defend our core interests, American people, of course, above all, our own physical country, but also our treaty obligations with our allies, et cetera. The fear right now is that, well, goodness, we've got China isn't going just gangbusters with their nuclear program. I mean, for the longest time, it was just, I remember I said, back when I was a college student, the country that could do the greatest harm and that was an adversary was the Russians. And it's because their nuclear program. That's where the most power is derived from, even the threat of nuclear use. And Russia has the most nuclear weapons. Well, now that's no longer the case. China is just investing an enormous amount of money into its nuclear weapons. And so the fear now is, well, we've never done this before. So at the height of the Cold War, the United States had one major nuclear power to deter. And Ronald Reagan successfully did that. And he wasn't the only one, but he was the guy who gets the most credit for it. And now we have both China and Russia. So the fear now is that with all of these conflicts, there's always this kind of cloud hanging over any kind of skirmish or conflict that it could escalate to the highest levels of violence, nuclear weapons. So my concern, however, is that the Biden administration is so kind of arrested with this fear of escalation that they have not been willing to, contend with these powers who are being belligerent. You mentioned the Chinese against the Philippines. I mean, it would be wise at this point for the United States to be providing an escort to some of these Philippine ships. Now, the concern is, oh my goodness, well, then what happens then if the United States... And so I said, well, it's a little bit counterintuitive. You actually do want to engage on the lower levels of violence and be successful in that, kind of punch them hard. I actually think there's recklessness in not engaging, because then what happens is the adversary just continues to escalate. It's not that there's an absence of escalation. It's just that the escalation happens on the adversary's terms. The Biden administration has been very, very afraid of escalation in the Middle East, very afraid of escalation with the Ukrainians and Russia. But the consequence of that fear of escalation is, I think they've left a lot on the table so that we could be helping the Ukrainians more, so that the Ukrainians can push the Russians out, so that the Russians don't continue to escalate. But we haven't done this in so many years. It's like we're out of practice in thinking about escalation management or the best way to do this, to convince our adversaries that the United States isn't going to just continue to step back and then just let them subjugate people.
I've thought about this a lot, particularly since the war in Gaza broke out. you kind of look at the history of that conflict, and all the way through it, when you look at kind of the talks around a peace process or the negotiations with Iran, there's a segment of our political leadership that seems to want to engage in like good faith negotiations with Iran, like Iran is a good faith negotiator. And again, you see it in this, all the talk about ceasefire negotiations. Obviously, there's been some successful negotiations to get some hostages out. But you can go back not that many years to the Gilad Shalit deal that Israel had with Hamas, in which they gave almost like 1,100 hostages to get one guy out. One of those was Sinwar, the head of Hamas. It seems as though when we go into these negotiations, whether it's with Hamas or Iran, and we're engaging in a way that's like, okay, we're going to do diplomacy. Diplomacy's going to work, and we're going to de-escalate. It never de-escalates. It's almost as though we've lost the muscle memory as a country to know how to negotiate these kinds of conflicts. What do you think is behind that?
There is a erroneous fundamental assumption about human nature that has taken hold. Again, this gets back to when we thought that trade would replace a lot of these other human instincts. You know, what motivates human beings? Well, a lot. Jealousy, desire for power, and ideology. Histories, long memories, feeling of grievances, revenge, lots of things motivate. So I think that there is a fundamental, still wrong assumption about what's motivating the Iran regime, what's motivating Vladimir Putin, what's motivating Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un. Each one of them these are different regimes and different histories and different people. They're all kind of idiosyncratic based on their own histories and ideologies. And that is very hard for Americans. And the further away we get from conflict, you know, it's almost like we've lost our capacity to understand evil. It's a lack of a moral imagination. And so I think that that is part of what is going on. And so I'm a big advocate of always allowing room for diplomacy with our adversaries. And so you want to have that hand stretched out of like, listen, I want to talk. I want to understand what you're thinking more. But you don't ever hold that out there without holding out the military capability to protect the innocent, to protect your people and your interests. You want to convince them that the best thing for them is to come up with some kind of negotiation. And if they won't, then we have consequences that are going to harm them. And we do not do that well. The country is not doing that with this administration. And that tends to be more of the progressive view. So when you think about it, this is like this, one of the fundamental sort of anthropological disagreements I have with my progressive friends is they really do believe that human beings are essentially all motivated. The Iranians want the same thing that we want. They want peace in the Middle East. They just want to have more of a say in the region. The Chinese want to share the region with the United States. It's just fundamentally, it's just not true.
Right. If you ask them what they want, they tell you what they want. That's the thing I always say this when I'm talking to people about what's happening with Israel and Hamas. Like, we should have no assumptions that Hamas and Israel want the same thing.
Hamas is seeking to maximize human suffering. Yeah. I even disagree when people say that Hamas uses human shields. Human shield has a connotation that they think that that shield is going to protect them. It's actually not. They're actually putting civilians, people in front of them so that Israel kills those civilians so that it can create this international pressure and harm the reputation of the Israelis, even though the Israeli government is seeking to discriminate and to discern between civilians and Hamas. But Hamas is seeking to maximize human sufferings, use these 6 Israeli hostages, including one American hostage that Hamas just executed. They videotaped their last words before they did that and then released them in order to maximize the suffering of the families. I mean, this is psychological warfare. This is why they use sexual violence. It's not an offhand thing that's sort of an unfortunate part of war that happens. Hamas uses it to maximize human suffering. And so that, I think people cannot wrap their minds around that, and to our great harm, and I think the great harm of our allies who, I mean, the Israelis see it, I think, pretty clearly.
We had this phenomenon, 9/11 happens, and the country comes together. There's this moment of moral clarity. I remember it was briefly called the Bush Doctrine. You know, we'll make no distinction between terrorists and the nations that hide them. And it felt like there was moral clarity in that moment for sure. But then the Iraq War happens. Shortly after the Iraq War, you have the Abu Ghraib scandal of, the abuse of prisoners and all this. When we look at a moment like this and we say, do we have the moral courage to stand up to China or to stand up to Iran or whatever? It's almost as though there's this sort of doubt has crept into the back of our minds to say, well, are we really the good guys? Like, like the meme with the 2 Nazis going, maybe we're the baddies. Like, there does seem to be this creeping doubt about, have we been an evil actor on the world stage? And if we have been, then who are we to stand up to Iran and tell them what they can or can't do, or stand up to China and tell them what they can or can't do, or stand up to Putin.
Yeah, so this is why, even though my focus is in defense and foreign policy, I still will speak to what's going on domestically because it matters. I mean, we are a democratic republic from a Christian perspective, and we are the lesser magistrates in a democratic republic. And so each individual American has to have some sort of idea about the U.S. role in the world, who we are as a country. Are we the good guys? Are we, that all of that matters. And I think it's good that that's part of who we are as a country, that we have to think about this. Of course, this is not, the PRC understands that, from Xi Jinping's perspective, this is what he thinks is an advantage. So nobody has to conceive of themselves in that way. He can just, because it's a totalitarian state. And so it's harder work for us, especially, people who are engaged in trying to help people think about things properly. But I do think that while all these threats are gathering, sort of the gathering storm of this new Cold War that I think we're in, at the same time, as you point out, we are a country really at war with ourselves. And part of that is because our leaders made very poor decisions that have created a lot of mistrust in institutions inside the United States. So you mentioned, Bush's war in the Middle East. I mean, I think President Bush, W. Bush's greatest moment was the bullhorn speech that he gave when in the rubble after 9/11, where he said, the terrorists will hear us soon. I can hear you, and the terrorists will hear us soon. And there was this moral clarity. I mean, people forget now people who are upset about Bush's wars in the Middle East forget that there's great national unity to go after and go get al-Qaeda. And I think where President Bush went wrong is that he misunderstood the capacity for the United States to build free and democratic societies, again, in countries that did not want them and did not have the cultural institutions to do it. I mean, we gave Iraq a constitution. We literally let them keep Sharia law in the constitution. It's the sort of the fundamental flaw where I think of, where I really came to the conclusion, like, oh my goodness, we have got to shrink our mission in Afghanistan like now. I mean, I was always for counterterrorism. That is something that the U.S. military can do. It keeps us safe in Afghanistan. But this trying to do the nation building in Afghanistan, I mean, our Marines would get punished, disciplined, if they would leave the base to go save little boys who were victims of sexual crimes with our Afghan allies who were just inside the wire or, working with us. And so it was like, we don't have the capacity. I mean, who we are as a country, I mean, the American founding is so unusual and so incredible in the history of the world for us to think that we're going to sort of force it on these other countries it was not going to happen. Then you start to have support for those wars flag, and people didn't support it. And then, of course, again, then you can go through back to the point that we were talking about before. We really thought that opening up trade with China would create peace and prosperity, but we didn't require the Chinese to actually change their particular behaviors. And so the United States did send a lot of manufacturing jobs to China because they don't have the same rights for their workers. And so they can make goods very cheaply. They essentially have slave labor in China. And so you saw a lot of economic detriment, and we lost a lot of our manufacturing ability and with it national sovereignty by relying now on a lot of the things that we make in China. All of these things to say is there's a lot of distrust now among Americans with the government and with institutions. And so now you have this rise of populism. A lot of these Western countries thought that free flow of migrants and immigration was going to be just a net positive, but didn't think about the other consequences about security and jobs and all those sorts of things that Americans are really concerned about now coming up in this wave of populism. So it's these confluence of events.
Which is what's driving the populism in Europe right now as well. I mean,
exactly.
There's a very ugly right-wing thing happening in Germany right now.
And it will continue to get worse as long as these countries, these people who are in power think that they're going to be able to just ride it out and let the populism die without actually addressing some of the fundamental concerns which have merit. Especially if you think about our own country. I mean, the people are the sovereign. And so it's the consent of the governed. And if the people are saying we've got to have control of our own physical borders and then make wise and prudent decisions about how many people come in and who they are, we can't just simply have open borders and just let people. So it's the confluence of all these things kind of happening at once. And then the larger point that I'm very concerned about is with it then, Jean Kirkpatrick was Reagan's UN ambassador, and she talked about how, it's always blame America. There's this, and that used to just reside on the left, that the United States was actually a force for evil in the world, not good. Now you're seeing that flare up on the right. And the United States has done a lot of things that are not good. I mean, Abu Ghraib was terrible, but we rightly denounce that.
And we sent the people who did it to prison, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's how that goes.
And there's a proper outrage because it is not who we say we are, and it is a violation of how the United States conducts itself. And so it doesn't define us. And so my view is, listen, we have a lot of divisions here in the United States, but none of it will be made better if the United States surrenders its global leadership role and surrenders and says, let the Chinese dominate things for a while. None of these things at home will be made better. All of them will be made worse. And we will not have the ability as a democratic people to resolve any of them.
Yeah. I think it was John Podhoretz who said, the problem we have right now is that the far right and the far left seem to agree on one thing, which is this country stinks, right? And so unless we get to a place where we're telling a better national story and have a better sense of our national story, there's much to be proud of being American. It's a cliche to even say I'm proud to be an American. I find myself even in this conversation getting
it's not as obvious.
Yeah, it's not as obvious.
And to which it's like, well, and part of it though is, yes, it's a better story, and this is our British friends are going through the same thing, rather than just saying we're against all of these things that are going on in their institutions. How do we actually paint a better way forward? So part of it is a story, but part of it is actually correcting some of these things. I mean, I'm a political conservative, and there is merit to the argument that our State Department essentially has been, rather than understanding that American principles and values are human rights, rule of law, democratic self-governance, all those things that we used to all agree on as Americans. There's always been people who disagreed, but I got it. But there was a consensus. But now you do have progressivism that has crept in. So now it's sort of like it's the pride flag to the left is synonymous with the American flag. And so that's where you have the pride flag put on American embassies when there's a Democratic administration. And that aggravates half of the American population. It also aggravates half of the populations of all, at least of those countries where this happened. So I do think that there needs to be a very serious course correction within our State Department, within our institutions abroad, about how we present ourselves as Americans and what we mean when we say American principles and values. Those are enshrined in our Declaration of Independence. We can agree on those things, and we need to have a restoration about what it is that we're doing abroad and what we're actually trying to encourage and discourage among our friends and allies and, of course, our adversaries.
Why should we care what happens in Ukraine? Why does that war matter for us?
Vladimir Putin wants to dismantle NATO. So the EU is just among Europeans. It's how they trade with each other. It's how they trade with the United States. And that's for them. But NATO is a security alliance, which, of course, the United States is the fundamental backer of that alliance because of our nuclear umbrella. And this is good for us. This is not sort of a freeloaders thing. You hear people say, well, we want the Europeans to do more for their own security. Yeah, absolutely. Because they've been going through some of these sort of cultural things and decisions that the United States got rid of a lot of our weapons, thought that we would just trade and wouldn't need to spend a lot of our resources here. And the Europeans did the same thing that the United States did with this peace dividend. But the United States provides a nuclear umbrella to our allies so that they don't get nuclear weapons, because if they do, you actually increase the odds of a nuclear conflict, and nuclear weapons are something that are going to affect all of us. So to the extent that we can, countries who don't have nuclear weapons, we don't want them to get them. And then, of course, the Brits do have their own nuclear weapons, but they work very, very closely with the United States within NATO, and then the French. And those are the only two countries. And then the French, still obviously a very active and important part of NATO, but their nuclear weapons also help complicate and confuse the adversary about what the Russians might do, against a NATO member and how we might respond. All of that is important context because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But Ukraine needs to be subjugated in order to weaken NATO, and Putin understands that. So Putin has, I actually thought it was when Tucker Carlson went to Russia and had his interview with Putin, I actually thought it was wonderful in this sense. Putin said what he was doing. So, Tucker kept even trying to say, isn't NATO, isn't it the woke stuff that's irritating you? And really tried to bait him into engaging in the culture war. NATO is part of the woke globalist movement. And so you're just responding against that. And Putin was like, no. And he gave a defense that went all the way back from the 12th century about why he believes that Ukraine and that Russian people anywhere, everywhere, belong to him or belong to the Russian Empire. And so Putin understands that if he is going to rule over Europe and sort of establish Russian rule that Ukraine has to go. They can subjugate Ukraine and they can break NATO that way. And then you have the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, small little. I tell people, Russian occupied Ukraine, just the territory that Russia occupies right now, is like 3 Estonias geographically. So when you hear people, it's like, oh, look, Russia can't even take Ukraine. You're not going to be able to take a member of NATO. I'm like, oh my goodness. Yes, you could. You could just gobble up Estonia in a couple of weeks. If that. They would put up an amazing, valiant fight, but apart from the NATO alliance and really get rid of all the euphemisms, the United States coming to their aid, they're toast. And so I really see, what I want. I want peace and prosperity for my children. I want the same kind of American century that I got to grow up in for my children and grandchildren. And that will happen if the United States remains the preeminent power. And for Europe, that means the strengthening and the survivability of the NATO alliance.
I think one thing people often fail to understand in some of this as well is like there's a reason why Hitler's aspiration was for Poland and Ukraine right off the bat. They call it the breadbasket of Europe, right? It truly gives you an incredible amount of economic leverage to hold that land. So we've got an election coming up here. And what is the Trump policy towards Ukraine? I mean, we know what J.D. Vance thinks. J.D. Vance has been very negative on it. But it seems like, as with many things with Donald Trump, moment to moment, it's hard to tell exactly what the policy would be.
Right. First, I'll start with the Biden piece, because I think that this is really important. Again, this fear of escalation. My biggest complaint with the current administration is that it says a lot of the right things, and then there's not a lot of doing the right things. And so the problem I have on Ukraine in particular is, one, I really do believe that the Biden administration came in trying to do basically the Russia reset part 2. So the Obama administration tried Russia reset after the Mitt Romney, when you want your foreign policy back from the Cold War, and really thinking that you can appease the adversary. What does he want? He just wants this. He doesn't want us to do that. He doesn't want the United States to impose economic sanctions for cyber attacks. And the Biden administration basically came in because, I mean, if you focus on the Trump rhetoric during the Trump administration, a lot of people kind of focused on sort of the Russia, the Steele dossier, and that's when you think of like Russia and the Trump administration. But the policies during the first Trump administration actually were tough on Russia and were on the side of Ukraine, sending a lot of key weapons to Ukraine that even the Obama administration believed would be provocative if they sent to Ukraine. The Trump administration also bolstered Poland, understood that a key to keeping Putin convinced that NATO was not dead and that NATO was going to continue getting strong was to protect these countries that are absolutely the ones that are on the front line of NATO right now. I mean, after Ukraine goes, it's the Poles and it's the Balts. And the Trump administration worked to increase their security. The Trump administration also was against that Nord Stream 2 pipeline that went from Germany to Russia. And the reason that energy pipeline was so important to the Russians was because it also, if that went through, it gave them the ability to box out the Eastern Europeans because it was this underwater pipeline. It allowed them to not to have to force to get along with Eastern European countries. And then it increased the reliance on Europe on Russian energy. And the Trump administration was against that. It had imposed sanctions, and Republicans imposed sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Biden administration comes in, immediately gets rid of the sanctions. That says it's not going to enforce sanctions over Nord Stream 2, and then also puts a hold on the weapons that the Trump administration had already approved to send to these Eastern and Central European countries. And then you had the Russians do other really bad stuff that we've forgotten as Americans, that we had just sent astronauts to the International Space Station, and the Russians launched an anti-satellite test that spewed tons of debris and created essentially a war zone around the International Space Station. And the Biden administration essentially did nothing about it. Thought that the Russians might invade Ukraine again, didn't want them to, and so was looking for ways to not upset the Russians further. And I think all of that set up for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we didn't even talk about Afghanistan withdrawal. So lots of things kind of with a backdrop. And so now the Biden administration has essentially set Ukraine up. Yes, President Biden has said the right things on the importance of NATO. The United States is going to be around, defend NATO, is going to be there to help Ukraine for as long as it takes. But he has not released the aid when Ukraine needed it. He has not permitted Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia where the Russians are actually preparing to hit Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians have to wait until they're like in the air before they can try to hit them with their air defenses. They don't have sufficient air defenses to do it that way. And essentially what has happened is it's this policy of only letting Ukraine defend itself has resulted in a long, protracted war of attrition. And that is a war, in my view, that Ukraine will lose. It's just a sheer matter of numbers and human beings and sons. And the only way this war is going to end on terms that help Ukraine and help NATO is if Ukraine is actually allowed to escalate sufficiently to convince the Russians that it's no longer in their interest to continue to prosecute the war.
I hear you on that 100%. But I look at a future Trump administration and I think H.R. McMaster's gone, John Bolton's gone, Mike Pompeo's gone. Maybe Pompeo's coming back. I don't know. But who's going to man the store? You know?
So that's the big question. I know better than to ever even try to speak for President Trump because I tell people, like, one of his great virtues is also advice, I think, and drives some of us crazy sometimes, but it actually has worked to his great advantage whenever he was commander-in-chief, which is that he's very non-ideological. Very, very, he sees himself as making deals. He wants to get the best deal possible. He also understands power. Doesn't mean that he exercises it in every way that we want him to, but Trump would go in there and say things like, and he even brags about it now. I mean, you listen to people. So you have, let me just say this. There are people on the right who really, really like Trump. And I think J.D. Vance was sort of the poster child of this view that are trying to make Trump more sort of neo-isolationist and sort of like, this isn't our war and who cares about Ukraine and et cetera, et cetera. That actually has not been the way Donald Trump has spoken about it or behaved whenever he was president. Am I concerned that there's some people who would try to drag him that way? I think that they will. But I also know that Donald Trump is persuadable to do the right thing. And his instincts are actually to, like, don't do that or I'm going to punch you in the mouth. He did that with the Iranians. He did that with North Korea. He did that with the Russians. And so the short answer is, I don't know now. I mean, we're in such a mess with Russia and Ukraine. How do you get out of it to the point where it's the best possible situation for Ukraine? I mean, I tell people from an American perspective, I would be satisfied with getting back to the 2022 borders before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now that Ukraine says, no, we want Crimea and the Donbass back, and I don't blame them at all for having maximalist views now, especially if they are going to come to the negotiating table. I think that they should say everything that they want. But I do think that the war is going to end with something like a negotiated settlement. But Russia will only ever stop and get out of Ukraine, the territory it's currently holding, if it understands that the United States will support Ukraine to the hilt. I mean, Ukraine is now going into Russia and holding territory. I mean, I saw this really interesting piece in the Tablet magazine by a writer who made the point that, in speaking with some Ukrainians essentially have watched Israel get so sick and tired of the Biden administration trying to restrain Israel that Israel is just now acting out and doing what it needs to do outside its territories. And Ukraine kind of thought, well, gosh, if we're going to continue to be restrained by the Americans, we're going to start acting out and prove to them that the Russians are not going to be so foolish as to have massive escalation. But Ukraine has to be able to have punishing blows against the Russians to get them to stop, or at least be willing to have a conversation about a deal. So I am very hopeful that there's still going to be really good people who are going to get in there and give President Trump, should he win the election, good advice. I really try not to get my sort of Trump views and knowledge from just reported media because there is so much of a bias against the man and his personality. But I have this running Word document of everything that Donald Trump ever says on Ukraine and Russia, and I kind of keep track of it. And since he left the White House, I'll say the first thing he was on Fox Business, and the host asked him, what would you do? This is right after Russia invaded Ukraine. And Trump said, first of all, it didn't happen on my watch. Which implies, though, that he's not for it, because people are like, oh, he doesn't care about Ukraine or he's pro-Russia. The facts don't support that. The other thing he said was, I would send a nuclear submarine to the region to tell the Russians to get out. You know, his reaction was actually strength to tell them to get out. And then the other thing that he said I thought was really interesting was that he's now bragged that he would end the war in 24 hours should he become president. And then he was pressed on that by a reporter. And they said, but what happens if Putin doesn't take that deal? And Trump's response was, then I'm going to tell Putin I'm going to send more weapons to Ukraine than we've sent so far, and he's really going to regret it. And I'm, sort of paraphrasing what he said. But the point, though, is it's not surrender. This is not like, just give it all to Putin and who cares. But it is this sort of combination of threats of military force to enable Ukraine and Russia to come to a conclusion. So I don't know how that will play out, but I'm not one of these people who just thinks that it's obvious that a Harris administration would be better for Ukraine. I mean, I tell the current course is unsustainable. And so I'm still very hopeful that given Trump's instincts in the past and the evidence from the first administration, that the right people in there, I don't think, Vice President, if he becomes vice president, his instincts on foreign affairs, I think, have been bad and have, in fact, not been in line with Trump's. And so my hope is that he doesn't have a prominent role in foreign affairs.
I really appreciate you sitting down with us. My last question, I guess, just because I can't resist but ask you about this. A couple days ago, Tucker Carlson had a sort of revisionist historian guy on, this guy, Daryl Cooper, essentially describing Churchill as the real villain in World War II. Given your background, your work, your emphasis, I just wanted to put it to you. Was Churchill the real villain in World War II?
No, Churchill is one of the greats. Charles Krauthammer said he was, kind of the indispensable character of the West in our lifetime or the last 100 years. The reason I think that's so concerning, I'll say for a couple points, I think it's really worth noting. Kind of two things. One is there is a rise of anti-Semitism in the United States right now. And to me, whenever you have a rise of anti-Semitism anywhere that's allowed to fester sort of in the open, it's a symptom of a larger sort of cultural sickness. And it's bad for all people of faith. It's bad for Christians. People say, like, well, what does it mean to me? It's like, oh my goodness, like to the extent that the Jews in the United States can live at peace and not be afraid of being harmed and are not looked at as, second-class citizens, but understand that they are created in the image of God and deserve full support.
You're almost quoting Washington's letter to the Rhode Island synagogue. That was his whole thing.
Exactly.
It's fundamental to who we are as Americans.
It's fundamental to who we are as Americans. It's part of our philosophical heritage as a Judeo-Christian founding, these principles. And so I had a Jewish friend of mine told me one time, he said, Rebecca, never forget, there's really only two places where the Jewish people can feel safe and be safe. It's the nation of Israel and it's the United States of America. Yeah. So I keep an eye on it now. Now, I will say that institutionally, anti-Semitism is residing on the left. The people who are marching in the streets and college campuses that are pro-Hamas, those folks are not voting for Donald Trump. Those folks are voting for, they support the left. And it's really part of the constituency. And it also is part of what's driving the Biden administration's hesitancy to back Israel even more. This is like the ultimate both sidesing something, which is just morally just atrocious and reprehensible. And this is a significant voter bloc, I think, on the left. And then institutionally, I do think that it's part of about how the Democrats sort of see the Israel and Iran problem. But on the right, it has popped up, and we saw this with the Buchananites, it's a part. If you really want the United States to turn inward and to just focus on our domestic challenges and to sort of eschew its role in the world as the moral and economic and military power, then you do have to disconnect American affections and concerns and views of our interests in Israel. You have to break that and then just let everybody just kind of to their own sort of devices. And then, of course, that would be the end of the nation of Israel.
Well, and you have to break with history, right?
You have to break with history.
You have to rewrite the story.
You do. And so the part of that I found just outrageous about it was that there were a lot of individuals on the right who popped up to finally someone said it, that Hitler kind of had a point and that Churchill was essentially the chief villain and then the warmonger. And it really, if you track the arguments, it's the same things that some of these folks have been saying about Putin, that the warmongers are the people who are keeping the war prolonged. Rather than seeing it properly, that, well, no, there is a sense of justice here, that Ukraine is the political innocent and that Russia is targeting civilians in Ukraine. And so I'm seeing the same logic being applied with this historian here in the case of Hitler and Churchill. Of course, he gets the history just backwards and all wrong, but the morality of it is awful. And I mean, it's deeply immoral. But it's key to, if you are sort of part of this neo-isolationist on the right, there's people who are applauding it because they want the United States to no longer have the post-World War II consensus, that the United States with Britain and with France, that we were right in the polls, that this is the West, what I'm actually, my life's work to restore American preeminence, to regain our ability to move in the world on terms that favor Americans in the best sense and our allies, to encourage the protection of human rights and national, all of those things that I think are good and that I want for my kids to live in a world that's like that. They don't want that. They actually want the United States to just become like every other country and to turn inward. And so key to that is breaking this consensus that the United States and Britain were right and that Churchill was a great hero. And so I will say, I was very upset by the reaction over 24 hours after that interview. I've been pleased to see some prominent folks come out kind of setting the record straight about who Churchill was and is. So, but it's key that anti-Semitism, but then also rewriting history about who the good guys and the bad guys were. I mean, fundamentally, the reason that in particular is so bad is it really does take away, fundamental to who we are as Americans, is that we do believe that all people are image bearers. And so regardless of all the different things that happened, if you believe that there is any kind of excuse at all or any kind of defense for the attempted extermination of the Jews at the hands of Hitler or in the concentration camps, if you can make any kind of defense of that at all, regardless of what even led up to that, you are pulling out it's nihilism, but it's an undoing of the American founding, which of course is rooted in my view is what is right and good in just government. And I believe that's their attempt, that's actually what they want to do. And that is a dark path. If you start to soft pedal that or act like, there is some sort of, justifiable reason for the behaviors of Hitler and Nazism, and you can justify anything and you're headed down a dark path. So very discouraging for a couple of days though, but I have been encouraged to see the kind of a smackdown of these ideas. But we got to keep at it though, because you don't want this stuff to take hold and you certainly want consensus to maintain.
Well, it speaks to everything we were talking about earlier as well. Just this moment we're living in where moral courage, moral clarity is so weakened. It's a primo example of how that's happening and why that's happening. Well, I really appreciate your time and joining us for this conversation. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.